Longtime Chinese critic Carl Bass, the founder and chief investment officer at Hyman Capital Management, joins us now. Carl, always great to have you on the show. You've long been warning and saying that you're concerned about the situation in Hong Kong. Do you expect action from the United States, perhaps a removal of the special relationship that Hong Kong now shares?
Yeah, great to be here, Julia. I can't imagine how once Beijing extrajudicially implements their own laws on top of the basic laws in Hong Kong, it basically strips the autonomy away from the Hong Kong region that Beijing agreed to when they signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984. That's a UN-filed document that Beijing is now walking away from. And, you know, they're walking away about 27 years early. They promised to leave Hong Kong sufficiently autonomous until 2047. There's a 50-year deal that they're abrogating about 27 years early. I'd like to go back to a comment you just made, Julia, which I find to be really interesting. You know, I think the world kind of takes, and especially the financial world, takes Ray Dalio's comments at face value, and nobody asks him who his largest investor is. You know, one of Ray Dalio's largest investors, from what the market knows, is China's government. And so for Ray Dalio to be the official spokesperson in the U.S. of, let's say, the macroeconomic community, when China is one of his biggest investors, claiming that China is a rising power and that the U.S. is just in a secular decline, I think the journalists that interview Ray Dalio should ask him how much money China has invested in his funds.
You think he has a vested interest in suggesting that the Chinese will rise relative to the United States?
Yeah, the way that the Chinese work is they enrich a few people, and those people become evangelical about the positive attributes of China. Look, it's kind of well known in market circles. I don't know this for an absolute fact because I'm not an investor in Bridgewater, nor am I a close friend of Ray's. But it's known that $5-6 billion of China's government money is invested in the Bridgewater funds.
And Ray Dalio, of course, here isn't here to defend himself either. But you make a very valid point that does there need to be greater scrutiny of investment in China? Chinese companies coming into the United States and trying to raise money, listed companies. It's a move that the U.S. Senate is looking at. I know you're in favor of this. Should this be enacted into law?
Yeah, and Julia, I want to be clear. I'm in favor of the playing field being leveled and U.S. investors being protected. And so right. This isn't an ejection of specific Chinese companies. What this is we need to raise our audit standards and basically have any international company that wants to raise money in the U.S., either through stocks or bonds, they should adhere to U.S. law. Right now, that's not the case, and China is the worst offender. I call it 90% of the offenses or more are Chinese companies. So we should allow them to either raise their standards to meeting U.S. law, or they shouldn't be allowed to raise money here. I mean, this is the job of the Securities and Exchange Commission in the U.S. to protect U.S. investors.
Level playing field makes sense. Level playing field in terms of access to Chinese resources and investment in that country is also a fair argument to make, but it simply doesn't happen. How do you want to see this relationship evolve, and how do you think it does as we head towards a presidential election in the United States? Because the rhetoric right now, and even the actions, are flying thick and fast between the U.S. and China.
Yeah, I mean, Julia, it's fun. They're fundamentally incompatible, right? We are the land of freedom and liberty and democracy, and call it fair trade. And they run a heavy-handed communist dictatorship where they repress their people for the benefit of the state. I mean, those two ideologies are fundamentally incompatible. And Martin Lee, one of the pro-democracy protesters, or not even protesters, the pro-democracy leaders of Hong Kong, he's 81 years old, was just arrested at his house a couple of weeks ago. He's the author of the Basic Law in Hong Kong. And in 1989, he predicted that one day this relationship between, let's say, China and Hong Kong, this one country, two systems ideology, which now we're seeing is changing to one country, one system. He predicted long ago that this would fail. because those ideologies are just conflicting with one another. And now we're seeing the crucible of those two world forces butting heads in the region of Hong Kong. And I think that doesn't bode well for Taiwan, and it doesn't bode well for the relationship between these communist dictatorships and the rest of the Western world. I think this relationship will continue to devolve. And I really don't think whether under President Trump or President Biden, it's going to change. I think it's only going to devolve going forward.
Hong Kong is ground zero, I guess, for the ideological clash that you're talking about here between a communist system and the foundations of democracy. Where does that leave Hong Kong? I know you're incredibly bearish anyway, and your fund is positioned that way. But what reaction do you want to see from the international community? Because it's not just about the United States. There are many countries around the world at this moment that are very frustrated with China and their handling of COVID-19. What should the response be?
Well, I have to unpack your questions. There were many questions there, but number one,
I apologize.
You call us bearish. I call us realistic about the situation between China, Hong Kong, and the West. So as we all know, Hong Kong basically has a couple of agreements signed. The definitive agreement for the governance of the region is the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984. And if you think back, Julia, I'd like to draw a few historical parallels. When Deng Xiaoping was negotiating with Margaret Thatcher, trying to get Hong Kong and the Kowloon area back under Chinese rule, this was in the early 1980s. That's when the Hong Kong currency collapsed 50% versus the dollar and the pound. When rumor got out that China wanted to take Hong Kong back after Hong Kong had enjoyed English law and British rule for over a century, the investors in the region started to panic. And that's what forced that action, those discussions forced the Hong Kong monetary authorities to peg their currency to the dollar. That was 36 years ago. When they handed Hong Kong back to the British in 1997, you remember, July 1st, 97 was the handover. July 2nd, 97 was when the Thai baht devalued and the Asian currency crisis happened. It was money leaving Southeast Asia, again, because China was becoming more, they were taking ownership of Hong Kong. Here we are today with China acting belligerently and abrogating contracts that they've signed, like the government does. And here we are. You're going to see a huge flight of capital out of Southeast Asia, given China's actions in the last few days.
And on top of already damaged economy as a result of COVID-19 and the protests before, triple challenge, I think. Yeah. Carl, I have to wrap you up there, but we will get you back, I promise. It's always great to chat to you. Thank you so much. Carl Bass, Founder and Chief Investment Officer at Hayman Capital Management. Great to have you with us.